walk through Daniel chapter 4 and avoid the topic of mental illness. We cannot look at a picture of a man who, had he walked into a hospital today, would have immediately been diagnosed with schizophrenia and medicated until he was drooling and left there without any hope. We cannot read this text that ends far differently than that starts for reasons other than those that would be supposed, according to our contemporary psychological and psychiatric models, without asking the question, what does this mean for those of us who are born again, blood-washed followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, and yet live in this real world where people have real problems and real difficulties? Do we just act like Daniel chapter 4 is not here? I mean, you can act like Daniel chapter 4 is not here, and we can not deal with the question of schizophrenia. But then you got to read Job, and you got to deal with clinical depression. Oh, well, we'll just act like Job is not there. That's fine. We'll deal with the Apostle Paul and the murders that he oversaw, and then we can talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, we don't really want to talk about that. Okay, fine. If you don't want to talk about that, let's talk about Jesus, shall we? In the Garden of Gethsemane, where he experiences a classic instance of anxiety. Or better yet, when he comes to the tomb of Lazarus, weeping there in depression, but then resuscitates Lazarus and they celebrate. Now he's bipolar. Let's not even talk about the Psalms, where you find every manner of what we would define as mental illness expressed by the psalmist himself. So even if you want to avoid the subject here in Daniel chapter 4, which you absolutely, positively cannot and must not, you have to face it somewhere. And you have to ask the question, what are we as Christians supposed to do? We've got a couple of possibilities. Possibility number one is we can simply say that that is not a place where we belong. We don't understand it, but there are other professionals who do. So let's just leave it alone. Well, that's an untenable position because it's right here in the Bible. So we can't leave it alone. Well, what's our other option? Well, the other option, there'd be a ditch on the other side of the road where we acted like we understood things completely just because of what we have here in the text as it relates to what's going on in people's minds. Bible's not designed as a mental health textbook, so to speak. So what do? Well, we take this little excursus and we talk about the main issues involved here. Let me tell you what I'm not here to do this morning. I am not here to give you an exhaustive understanding of the way the Bible deals with the issue of mental illness. I am not here to give you an exhausting understanding of psychology and psychiatry. That's not my goal here. My goal here, however, is to give you a basic lay of the land so that we can at least talk about this in a way that honors our Lord Jesus Christ, recognizes what it means to be born again, to be saved, and it recognizes what it means to be a bipartite human being, having physical and spiritual abiding simultaneously together. Now, let me just say, full disclosure, it's a blessing at a church this size. I was able this week to pick up the phone and have conversations with one, a family practice specialist, two, a psychiatrist, and three, an emergency room physician, all of whom are members right here in this church. Imagine that. And so I did that. Why? Because this is not my area of expertise. And yet, because this text is in the Bible, and because I shepherd real people with real problems, it is incumbent upon me to know something about this. It is not an option for a pastor to see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil when it comes to this issue of mental illness. That is not allowed. That is dereliction of duty. We're responsible to walk with people who have real difficulties. So why is it so hard for us to talk about this issue? Several reasons. Number one, because of our psychologized culture. There are presuppositions with which we live that make it difficult for us to talk about this passage or to even think about this passage in the right way. For example, the number one most completed class in college is Psychology 101. More people complete that course than any other course on the college level. Everybody takes psychology. Very few people. I've talked to a couple of engineers who said that they didn't take psychology, but I mean, some people, just a few people will get away with not taking psychology. But more likely than not, if you took any class in college, you took Psychology 101. And it's terrible because you think you now know psychology. It's like people who take one class in philosophy and think that they can philosophize about everything in the world. But we take one class in psychology, we think we know psychology. Secondly, the acceptance of psychiatry into the medical community has changed the way we think about this issue of mental illness and has gone a long way towards psychologizing our culture. Thirdly, overdiagnosis. All of us know someone who has been diagnosed with something. I can give you a brief list, and it would hit most of us in the room when it comes to the people whom we know. We start with the one that is most popular today, which is bipolar disorder. Secondly, depression. Thirdly, anxiety disorder, or social anxiety disorder, known as SAD. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADD or ADHD. Post-traumatic stress disorder. As long as we've been engaged in wars across the world, this one has become huge. It's on everybody's lips these days. And of course, the ubiquitous chemical imbalance. All of us know somebody with one of these diagnoses. Many of us are somebody with one of these diagnoses. Another reason that we're psychologized is because of these drug commercials. Where does depression hurt? It hurts everywhere, okay? We see these commercials and they come at us. And folks, we believe that mental illness is actually the new norm. Movies and television programs, dramas, police dramas, where the psychologist is the one who knows everything about the person who's doing this crime. Why? Because if you're a psychologist, you are all-knowing. This person is probably this age, and he probably grew up like this, and he probably has to. All the while, you over here are looking at the other part of the movie that these cops are not seeing, and what are you being told? The person with the psychology degree is God. Destigmatization. Far from there being a stigma anymore with mental illness, and I'm not saying that it's good or bad or whatever for stigma, but there was stigma attached to mental illness. Now we're proud of our mental illnesses. We wear them like a badge. We won't tell people our phone number, but we'll tell them our diagnosis. We are living in a psychologized culture. Not only that, but there has been a marginalization of the church in this regard. How so? The overwhelming majority of pastors who have any theological training have basically been given this kind of training when it comes to mental illness and mental disorders. If somebody has a small problem, you can help them. If they have a big problem, call a professional. Because God cannot handle mental illness. Pastors are taught that. Christians are taught that. And we believe that with every fiber of our being. And so we will run to a mental health professional, go get treatment, go get put on psychotropic drugs, and not even consult our pastor. Why? None of his business, not his area. We're going to talk about how dangerous that mentality is. Then, of course, there's the history of psychology itself. And we could spend a lot of time talking about this journey, but let me just give you a picture because I want you to understand something. We believe that psychology and psychiatry are sciences like chemistry or physics. But we believe if somebody says you have a chemical disorder or a chemical imbalance, that actually what has happened is they've given you a test and they have tested the level of chemicals in your body. And because of that scientific test, they now know that you're outside of range. We think about it. We think it's sort of like blood pressure. Your systolic ought to be between here and here. Your diastolic ought to be between here and here. And we can test you with a machine. You're not between here and here. Therefore, you have high blood pressure or you have a low blood pressure. We think about the term chemical imbalance in that exact same way because we assume that these people are doing science. And most Christians don't know that there is no such thing as chemical imbalance. There's no test for it. There never has been a test for it. Here's the other thing. Everybody's chemistry is different. It's not like blood pressure, where you can go, here's where these chemicals are supposed to be in your brain, and here's where they are. No, not like that. Had a dear friend of mine over my house. We were having a discussion about this. Almost lost a friendship over this because somehow this issue came up, this whole chemical imbalance, bipolar, whatever. And I just sort of alluded to the fact that there is no test for it and that it's not a scientific diagnosis. It's not a medical diagnosis. He said, no, it is because I got a family member who has this and they're treated for this and their doctor tested them for this. And I said, no, actually, they didn't. They had a conversation about how they feel and how they function, and then they were drugged. No. Picks up the phone in the midst of the discussion, calls his friend, who's also his family physician, and says, listen, I got, this is my buddy, he's my real buddy, but I think he's out to lunch because he's trying to tell me that there's this chemical imbalance thing, that there's no test for it, that it's not scientific, that you guys, that you're treating my family member and that you haven't actually done any real medicine in order to determine that this, and you can just see him on the phone, his whole countenance changed. What? What do you mean there's no way you can test for that? What do you mean there's no way that you can know for certain? What are you telling me? It's a fact, folks. That's why we use the term syndrome or disorder. There is no test for it. And if you look at the history of psychology, what you see is a movement historically from one worldview to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And we believe a certain school of psychology. We start with structuralism and Wilhelm Wundt. Then we move to functionalism, people like William James, and then, of course, psychoanalysis with Sigmund Freud. And why do we move from one of these to the others? Because we prove that they don't work. And then Freud is found to be fraudulent, and so we come to behaviorism. And in behaviorism, we know people like Pavlov and B.F. Skinner, and we're there, and we get that, and we understand that that's the new school of thought. Eventually, you move from there to humanistic psychology. After that, you move to Gestalt. All of these based on differing roles, norms, and mores within the psychological community. A lot of people also don't realize that the way these diagnoses come about is, again, if it's not through testing, because here's what you're saying to me. Now, wait a minute. You're saying that these doctors aren't testing people to determine that they have this. How do they come up with these diagnoses? They vote. The psychological community gets together. They talk about groups of symptoms that they see. They give it a name. And if enough people in the room raise their hand, it gets into the diagnostic and statistical manual and it becomes an official diagnosis. Why is that important? Because that's the only way that you can get insurance companies to pay for it. That's it. Can you imagine doctors voting on whether a heart attack is a heart attack? Taking a poll as to whether high blood pressure is high blood pressure? Opening you up, taking things out, hoping that it solves your problem? You feel better? We stay here. You don't? We're going to take something else. We would not stand for it. But in the mental health community, we don't even question it. That, my friends, is a huge problem. Well, what's the main problem with psychology, psychiatry? I don't argue that they're of absolutely no value, but there are problems. Let me give them to you. And then we'll look at Nebuchadnezzar and talk about some of the implications of these things. Number one, it's quasi-scientific at best. It's quasi-scientific at best. That's a problem. And it's really a problem because of the second problem, which is a lack of accountability. You see, if a physician, an MD, a heart specialist or whatever, if they go in and they take out the wrong thing, you sue them for malpractice. Because they were supposed to test you, they were supposed to take images, they were supposed to know what they were doing. If they go in there and do the wrong thing, you're in trouble. They make a mistake, you're on the table, you die, they're in trouble. There's a malpractice lawsuit. If a psychiatrist, based on a syndrome that was voted upon by another group of psychiatrists, gives you a diagnosis and then gives you a drug, and then as a side effect of that drug, you go and commit suicide, you cannot sue them. Why? Because it wasn't a scientific diagnosis in the first place. Therefore, they cannot be held specifically accountable when there's no specific thing that they're dealing with. And they hide behind this thing called standards of practice. Estimated that as many as 40,000 deaths a year are directly related to psychotropic drugs. And yet, psychiatrists are not held accountable. Why? Because they're not doing actual scientific tests. They're not treating actual medical illnesses. Therefore, there's a lack of accountability. There's also an absence of results. Let me say this, and please hear me clearly. Psychiatry and psychology have never cured anyone of anything, nor do they claim to be able to. Let me say that one more time slowly. Psychology and psychiatry, and they're not the same thing. One's a medical doctor who goes to medical school, a psychiatrist, gets a medical degree, okay, and they can dispense drugs, and it's pretty much all they do, just dispense drugs and balance drugs. The other one's psychologist, you don't go to medical school, that's a completely different degree, okay? But in both instances, psychology and psychiatry have never cured anyone of anything. By the way, in order to cure somebody, you have to be able to diagnose them accurately, right? If you can't diagnose someone accurately and there's no test to demonstrate what a person has, how could you know if you cured them? You can't. They've never cured anyone. They don't claim to be able to cure anyone of anything. These things are important to know, folks. I'm not telling you my opinion, by the way. Everything that I've stated for you up to this point is just pure fact. Fourth problem, dangerous side effects. Dangerous side effects. Just listen to one of the drug commercials. Dangerous side effects. Here's an antidepressive medication, okay? You're depressed, so we want to give you this medication. By the way, if you start thinking about killing yourself or somebody else, call us immediately. Why? Because it's one of the side effects of your medication. Wrong worldview. This is a problem with psychology and psychiatry. Wrong worldview. It's based on a materialistic worldview that sees nature as a closed system and man basically as a machine. It does not account for the bipartite nature of the human being, that there is a physical side of him and that there is a spiritual side of him. They only treat the physical side, are not equipped to deal with the spiritual side. Don't acknowledge it. Don't account for it. It can't. And then there are the theological inconsistencies. Listen to this. Thomas Zaz, by the way, is a psychiatrist who is sort of at variance with his profession. Because some of you right now are a little uncomfortable with some of the things that I'm saying, because we don't talk like this about psychology and psychiatry. They get a free pass. They're not questioned. Somebody says you're bipolar, you're bipolar. Somebody says you have clinical depression, you have clinical depression. Somebody says you got a chemical imbalance, you got a chemical imbalance. No questions asked. Take this pill. Yes, sir. So we're not used to talking like this. So again, and who am I, right? I'm just a pastor, just a Bible teacher guy, okay? Thomas Zahn, he's not a pastor. He's not a Bible teacher guy. He's a psychiatrist. In 1961, he penned the classic, The Myth of Mental Illness, where he refuted the idea that mental disorders were on par with physical illness and could therefore be treated with medication. In his view, mental illness does not constitute actual disease, but rather problems in living. I didn't say that. A psychiatrist said that.